gracias a todos por estar aquí y todavía estamos esperando a nuestro colega de Lituania, pero antes de empezar quisiera daros la bienvenida a este seminario sobre digamos el pasado, el presente y futuro de los países bálticos. Este seminario se lleva a cabo con el motivo de la publicación del libro Historia de los Estados Bálticos y hoy tenemos el placer contar con la presencia del autor de este libro, señor Andrés Kasekamp, también con la representante de Letonia, excelentísima señora Argita Daudze, embajadora de Letonia en el Reino de España. Y también va a venir el señor Mindaugas Jurkynas, catedrático de la Universidad Vytautas, ahí está, de la Universidad Vytautas Magnus. Vale, muy bien. Y el debate va a ser moderado por el director del Real Instituto Elcano, señor Charles Powell. La historia siempre ha tenido un papel importante en la conciencia de las naciones y las naciones bálticas no son diferentes. Es sumamente importante para nosotros conocer nuestra historia y también aprender de ello. Porque como se dice, sin recordar el pasado no hay futuro. Y por supuesto el vínculo entre el pasado y el futuro se radica en el presente. Por tanto, para mejorar las decisiones que tomamos hoy para mañana, es importante tener en cuenta las lecciones de ayer. A mí me parece que algunas naciones o algunos países lo hacen con más éxito y algunos con menos. Y obviamente ganan ellos que aprenden más. Estoy convencido, por ejemplo, que España ha tenido mucho éxito en aprender de su historia, preservando democracia, y espero que los países bálticos sean exitosos también por los mismos motivos. Saber apreciar el valor verdadero de la democracia es siempre más fácil tras una etapa histórica complicada. Y yo creo que esto es algo que compartimos nosotros en ambos lados de la Unión Europea. Yo creo que es especialmente importante prestar atención a nuestras experiencias del pasado en estos tiempos tan turbulentos para Europa. Hay mucha incertidumbre y muchas ganas de revertir a las soluciones simples, que a veces también se llama populismo. Por supuesto, algunas soluciones simples parecen buenas y también son buenas, pero la complejidad del mundo, yo creo, nos ha enseñado que la mayoría de las soluciones nunca pueden ser fáciles. Por eso, y volviendo al motivo del seminario, os quisiera reiterar la importancia de nuestros conocimientos y experiencias históricas para asegurar un mejor entendimiento del presente y del futuro. Espero que el debate sea interesante e instructivo y que podamos reflexionar sobre estos temas para un futuro mejor. Os agradezco a todos por vuestra presencia aquí y os deseo un seminario agradable. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias, Rasmus, por tus palabras y sobre todo por haber tenido esta iniciativa. Yo conocí al autor del libro, a Anders, hace ya algunos años. El libro que hoy presentamos, de hecho, se publicó en el año 2010 y desde entonces han aparecido sucesivas traducciones a 4 o 5 idiomas, incluido el español. Y para mí supone realmente, para mí, para el Real Instituto Elcano, supone un honor y un placer estar hoy aquí con todos ustedes. Y me alegro mucho de que las tres embajadas de los países bálticos hayan podido colaborar en esta iniciativa. Me alegra en primer lugar porque en España, seamos sinceros, nuestro conocimiento sobre los países bálticos es escaso, es mucho más lo que ellos saben de nosotros que lo que nosotros sabemos de ellos, y por lo tanto nos parecía interesante dar a conocer lo que sin duda va a ser el texto de referencia sobre la historia de esta región en castellano durante muchas décadas. Me agrada especialmente poder hacerlo con Anders, con el cual tengo algunos puntos en común. Anders es historiador, es profesor de universidad, pero también es director de un think tank, del principal think tank de su país. Y por lo tanto, creo que es un buen ejemplo de que a veces resulta posible compatibilizar y complementar estas dos actividades. Y me agrada muy especialmente también que esté hoy con nosotros la embajadora de Letonia, que también es historiadora, es doctora en historia y autora de varios textos sobre la historia sueco-letona. Y por lo tanto, como ven, los países bálticos nos envían a sus mejores embajadores, y creo que para nosotros es también un motivo de orgullo que esto sea así. Bien, sin más, I'm going to switch to English so that we can have a conversation amongst the three of us. Before doing so, I also want to greet the ambassadors of Sweden, Andorra, and Norway, and Lithuania.
Finland.
Sorry, Finland, I'm sorry. Roberto. I know you are the Finnish ambassador. And I also want to say hello to my good friend Camilo Villarino, who has recently returned to Madrid as chef de cabinet of Foreign Minister Dastis. And it's great to have you with us, Camilo. So we'd like to have a conversation today about the book, and I'd like to start by asking Anders what led him to write this book. It's a very ambitious project because the book starts in the Middle Ages and takes the story right up to the present day. And it's never easy to write about three different states, three countries, three states which have known independence for 100 years, which you will be celebrating shortly. But three states which are nevertheless, of course, quite different and have different histories. So what led you to embark on this project? And in particular, what would you extract from this experience as an author and a historian?
Well, first of all, thank you, Charles, and thank you for your team at Elcano for organizing this event, and also the three embassies for inviting me. And I'm also very gratified that there's a fairly large audience for a topic which perhaps isn't so everyday here in Madrid. The reason I wrote the book was there was an obvious need to explain Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian history to a wider audience. And the original is in English, and the Spanish version is the 9th translation. I've presented it in Tokyo and Moscow and elsewhere. And it's been received well as filling a gap. And also I presented it in Riga and Vilnius, and the Estonian readers have often told me that, the Estonian part and the Latvian part is very familiar, but wow, those Lithuanians, that's really strange. We had no idea about how exotic they are from the point of view of an Estonian, and I hope a Lithuanian reader would have the same moment of discovery about Estonians, because obviously from the outside we're all perceived as being one unit, but when you delve into it, you see that they are very, very different. Of course, linguistically, Latvians and Lithuanians are close, but Estonians and Latvians are closer in terms of perhaps the cultural heritage because of the legacy of 700 years of German domination, German institutions which shaped sort of a common Estonian and Latvian era. Whereas Lithuania, of course, has a lot in common with Poland. The historical connections. But indeed, most history writing has been national. Histories of Estonia, histories of Latvia, histories of Lithuania. But if you are, to be honest, a student at a university in Madrid or in the US or the UK, you're probably not going to, in your general survey of European history, want to read a book on one history of Estonia, one history of Latvia, and one history of Lithuania. You'll want to have them related in one story. And that was really tricky. First of all, I believe in the comparative approach, that it offers insights about the other peoples. But now this national approach also, it's been not just the history of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania separately, but it's been generally the history of Estonians or the history of Latvians and Lithuanians as peoples. And so it's also been a challenge to write about all of the peoples who have lived on these territories, because Estonia and Latvia did not exist as the administrative units that they are today before the 20th century. So I'm covering the territories and the peoples who live where the three countries now lie. But these include Swedes, Jews, Poles, Germans, Russians, and others, and to weave them into the story. So it's not just a national story, but it's a story of this territory, was a great challenge.
Thank you. One of the reasons I was asking you is because nowadays, of course, it's actually almost unfashionable to write national histories. People even question the academic validity of that approach. In Britain, for example, when you write about Britain, the accusation is often made that you're really writing about England and passing it off as a history of Britain. So now everyone is trying to write histories of Britain which have a quarter dedicated to England, another quarter to Scotland, another quarter to Wales, another quarter to Northern Ireland, which is, I think, slightly defeating. Argita, what, as a non-Estonian reader, what impression did you get from this book? Yes, it's on.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the Estonian embassy to having this initiative to organize presentation of very good book about the history of Baltic states, and also inviting Latvia to participate, and I'm sure that the Lithuanian colleague will say the same about Lithuanians. Yeah, that we feel here in Madrid a good team of three ambassadors, and we represent our countries helping each other, and this is one of the cases. And thank you, Elcano Institute, for bringing the topic of Baltic states to agenda again, and using to my mind, a very good precondition for that. It's a book, but it's also that what Mr. Powell already mentioned. It's upcoming celebration of 100 years of our independent statehoods. For Lithuania, the new statehood. For Latvia and Estonia, the first statehood in history. What we had in 1918. Yes, the book is translated in several languages, as Mr. Kasekamp mentioned.
Latvian was first.
And Latvian version was first, yes. So I bought it and read when it appeared in bookshelves in Latvia, in Latvian bookshops. And I read it with interest and really admired the author's ability to put pretty different histories of three different peoples in one not so thick book. Mm-hmm. And it is an advantage. And so for readers, those who are willing to become acquainted with history and the present of Baltic peoples and Baltic states. When I received the invitation to this event, I was a bit intrigued with the title Presente y futuro de los países bálticos, but the book is about history. So, and I understood that Mr. Charles Powell, as historian himself, is not able to get away from intrigues. And the intrigue actually is for us historians very understandable. So when we study history, when we make research, and we make our conclusions, though we usually think that it can be useful for predicting, at least to dare to predicting a future. In Riga there is one museum, a very nice one, open air, Latvian ethnographic museum, and at the entrance there is one monument, and at this monument is written in Latvian, kas pagātni pētī, tas nākotni vētī. And it means the one who studies history predicts future. Whether it is so, I wouldn't be so sure, but at least there are attempts to do it, and historians usually try to advise in a very humble way the possible risks what can be faced if some learnings of history is not taken into account. And historians are people who are sometimes not so humble, not so shy, but rather straightforward people, and I'm confident that historians who we are here in this audience would agree with that, and Finnish ambassador as well, knowing that you are historian. By the way, when your country is mixed with another country, it reminds me how Latvia is mixed with Lithuania so often. Yeah, but at least we are in one region, yeah, and it is positive.
I'll never live up to
that this was a Freudian slip.
Yes. But speaking about this brave historian, I would like to turn attention to Polish historian, diplomat, even a foreign minister for shorter time, Stefan Meller. And he was the one who initiated publications of documents of Polish Soviet Union relations. And in the preface for such a book of documents published in Moscow, 2005, he wrote like this: as we historians are able to demolish evil of the past and to stigmatize those immature politicians who are thrilled by this evil. I think it is very strong words, and probably historian is taking too much responsibility on his shoulders, but there are a possibility, of course, to know a bit more than general public knows about the events in the past, and to knowing them, to evaluate them. Regarding the history of Baltic states, I think it is very relevant also to keep in mind these words, because the history of 20th century of Baltic states was full of very unpleasant events, and the peoples were suffering a lot from the domination of other powers in Europe. I think Mr. Kasekamp managed to show in a very balanced way how people in the Baltic states territory, which was territory which was occupied by Soviet Union, then by Nazi Germany, then by Soviet Union again, how people lived through the very hard times. One thing what I found not satisfactory for my interest was that Mr. Kasekamp doesn't mention exile Balt community. And the Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians were split nations during the occupation time of Soviet Union, and they also lived and worked their life in exile in different countries in the world. The biggest communities were in United States, in Canada, in Australia, United Kingdom, and smaller in European countries. And this exile community, but also the exile governments or the diplomats with extraordinary full powers also did a very important part of defending the rights of Baltic states in the process of regaining their independence in 1991. And I wanted just to mention this concept of de jure and de facto. So de jure, these three states were continuing to exist despite of the occupation of by Soviet Union. And this possibility was given because of the non-recognition policy, which was introduced in 50s by Western powers. And this non-recognition policy, the jure existence of the Baltic countries, gave a possibility for diplomatic representatives to continue their work. So all three countries had their legations, diplomatic representations in Washington and also in London, but also for a period of times in case of Latvia, in Brazil, and also in Spain. In Spain was a diplomatic representative, Robert Campos, from 1953 to 1969. And he was one of those diplomatic representatives of Eastern Central European countries, which were at that time called captive nations. So I think I already took a lot of your time, sorry for that, but I thought it is important to mention also the aspect of exiles and the governments in exile. Thank you.
Thank you, Argita, for raising that. Anders was born in Toronto, so I'm sure he has a lot to say about that community, and will do so in a minute. But let me first of all invite Mindaugas to give us his version. He no doubt read the Lithuanian edition, or perhaps the English one. Did you read the English one?
Well, first of all, hello everyone, excellencies, dear friends of the Baltic states and interested people. Allow me to bring my apology for being a little bit late. We stuck a little bit in traffic, then we hit the road on foot, but we managed on time, and now I got my cue. Of course, I extend my gratitude for being here to the Estonian embassy, to Lithuanian embassy, to Latvian embassy for participation, and to this Real Elcano Royal Institute for organizing the event with such a tremendous audience. And I hope that the message and the discussions get across and give a good take of my messages. Well, I read actually the English version when it came out for a very simple reason, since I had a course on the Baltic states for May students, so I had to give the excerpts for them to read on the Baltic states, especially the historical part, and Andrew's book was the first book of reference, and that was a great help. Although I'm a political scientist, I specialize on Northern Europe, on identity and cooperation of states here in the Baltic states and Scandinavia, but my initial education is historian. And I always remember from my Latin classes some Latin sentences that first, historia est magistra vitae, that history is the teacher of life, and the other is that homines historiae ignari semper sunt pueri, that people who do not history always remain children. So in order not to repeat the mistakes or to get our accumulated experiences sustainable in our present life, to apply the knowledge, I think that the history books are very, very relevant. And in that respect, Andres' book is in a way, Andres the builder, Andres the identity builder, I thought. I mean, the book, even though he said that yes, we are similar, yes, we are different, yes, we feel a lot of sympathies and share a lot of empathies, nonetheless, his book contributes with the multilingual translations for the understanding of the Baltic region, which has been on the map for quite a number of years. And when we speak about togetherness, this identity, then we always do the cherry picking. We can always silence differences. We can always pick up commonalities, and then we always realize that there are so many things that can connect us together. And as the Latvian ambassador very aptly mentioned, that the current cooperation on the embassies here in Madrid is very much alive, and our ambassador has confirmed that on my trip here. So it means that the book reflects the current Baltic togetherness, the empathy to connect those similarities and find common solutions. It doesn't imply that Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are just within this region. There are a lot of cooperation going on with the Nordic countries within the Nordic Baltic 8 framework, and a lot of bilateral relations, and let alone a lot of cooperation and trade-offs within the European Union and in international organizations. But on the other hand, this Baltic togetherness is based on quite a few similarities. Of course, you can always pinpoint to certain differences, linguistic, cultural, heritage, institutional, and so on. But at the same time, there are many, many nodal points which connect the Baltic togetherness. And we start already with the years after the First World War, when breakaway country from the Tsarist Russian Empire, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, even Poland to a certain extent, they comprise this new path of building nation states after the authoritarian Tsarist regimes. Then we go through their consolidation of independence and membership in organizations, and their conundrums that they had to solve in the interval years, and when they built the Baltic Entente, the Baltic common institution of diplomatic cooperation, exchange of ideas in the mid-30s, and then of course the notorious years of the Soviet occupation and Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact at the end of the 30s, which maybe even cemented the idea of the Baltic region confined to the 3 Baltic states and Finland to some extent. But then the second Soviet occupation and annexation gave birth to the Baltic region, notoriously so, but at the same time it also paved the way for the fight for freedom, for very active exile communities which have always sustained the idea of independent and sovereign countries when the due time comes. And in that respect, it didn't come as a major surprise that at the end of the 80s, with a very active involvement of different layers of people in exile communities, the singing revolutions occurred. And the Baltic Popular Fronts cooperated, and then the first announcements of independence and support of each other, the deputies, Congress in the Soviet Union, it all made this Baltic togetherness very much alive. Apart from that, the path that Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia had to follow on this quadruple post-communist transformation, which in my reading would be one of the most unprecedented in the world, since these countries had to move from the authoritarian states to democracies, they had to build nation states, they had to move from the planned economy to the market economy, which none of the countries have ever experienced. Even the countries which had a streak of authoritarian rules like Portugal, Spain, Greece, let alone countries in Latin America, they always had market economy. But the countries in the former Soviet world, they had to follow, the method of trial and error, because nobody on earth could have advised how to create market economy being the member of planned authoritarian economy. And the fourth pattern of transformation was transatlantic integration, because in order to be the members of NATO and members of the European Union, the countries also had to reform tremendously institutionally, economically, in terms of rule of law and so on and so forth. So this transformational experience is this brand of change, of positive experiences, also add up to another element of Baltic togetherness in my reading. But I'll stop here because I guess there are other topics too.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You've raised some very interesting issues that I hope we can come back to. But before I allow or ask Anders to come back on the exile community issue, I think there's a very interesting thing that emerges in the book, which is that of course, we tend to think of the Baltic states as very new states because they are very new democracies. But what about those early 20th century legacies and even pre-20th century legacies? And one of the very ambitious things about this book, which I like most, is in fact that you keep reminding us of those continuities. So what would your message be to, say, youngsters in the Baltic states who have perhaps a tendency to think that that the world began in 1991 or, after the collapse of the Soviet Union? How are you able to reconnect with that past?
Well, first of all, let me say that I don't think it's much of a problem for Lithuanians, because Lithuanians are all keenly aware that in the late Middle Ages, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was the largest state in Europe. So Lithuanians have, I think, perhaps a slightly different perception of their history than Estonians and Latvians, who during that period, after following the Northern Crusades in the 13th century, were under the domination of German landowners until the 20th century. That's of course one of the interesting features, that no matter who was the ruler, be it the Tsars or the Swedish kings or the Polish kings or the Danes, that the local elite was always the Baltic Germans in the Estonian and Latvian case. That's completely different in the case of Lithuania. So there's a long continuity there. And in fact, the first Baltic histories that were written already decades ago were actually Baltic in the very narrowest sense, that they were written by Baltic Germans about themselves, about the area which is basically today Estonia and Latvia. The question of exiles is, perhaps I was being a bit modest in that, since I grew up in Canada myself, I didn't want to perhaps bring in that part overly, but I'm glad that you mentioned it now. And of course, the point of the book is that it is thin. My Estonian colleagues, who have a more traditional, my older Estonian colleagues have a very traditional approach, this von Rankian approach, is you go to the archive, you collect all the documents, and if you've seen all that trouble of digging all these things up from the archive, you want your reader to know that you have done all this work. And so when your typical Estonian history books are like this, and full of documents, and I think the real point, of course, is being able to select what is significant and leave out what is less significant, make generalizations and comparisons, and of course you want the audience to actually read your book. So thus this sort of a format. And let me pick up on what Mindaugas was saying very nicely about Baltic cooperation and unity, that in fact this past few weeks I've been back and forth corresponding with Palgrave Macmillan, the original British publisher, producing a second updated edition, bringing events right to the present. They have a new cover design. The original cover design in English is a landscape painting, because it's in a series called The Essential Histories of Nations. And it has a landscape of the Baltic Sea, which could be any of the three countries. But now in this updated version, they have a new design So for History of France, they have Napoleon on the cover. So they have one prominent individual. And I've been trying to convince them that it's not possible in the Estonian case to put the Baltic case, to put one prominent individual. You need three, but that goes against their policy. And the only, unfortunately, common figures that we have are foreign conquerors like Stalin and Hitler, and we don't want them on the cover, do we?
Thank you very much.
And a very interesting point that was made earlier is how these countries have changed. And I think people like Argita, who's already spent some time in Madrid, although she is a relative newcomer, but she knows a lot about Spain. I think they are very quick. You are very quick to detect that Spain and the Baltic states do actually have more in common than perhaps initially meets the eye. We are all young democracies. We have all experienced very rapid socioeconomic growth in the last decades. We are all very Europeanist and very Atlanticist. So we do actually share, perhaps as a result of having emerged from decades of authoritarian dictatorship and having experienced transitions to democracy recently, we do share, I think, a common legacy. Mark Twain, by the way, of course, used to say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, which I think is quite elegantly put. Argita, I wanted to ask you, when you look at the Baltic region from Madrid, do you see a region? Do you see European member states? Do you see 3 different nation states? So we're talking about the present now. And how European do the Baltic states feel today? And how do they see Europe? What is their perception of Europe? What are the meanings of Europe for the citizens of the Baltic states today?
Thank you, Charles. Yes, 1.5 years in Madrid and visiting also some other places and trying to re-establish some contacts and having conversations with Spaniards on history and today on Spain and my country. I can feel that there is a certain gap of knowledge about Latvia and other and 2 neighboring states of my country, Lithuania and Estonia, but there is pretty genuine interest. And what is that? What is encouraging and motivating for working in order to promote my country in Spain and to promote this commonness. And I fully agree with you, Charles, when you say that there are really much more common than we can even imagine. True, Latvia, and I'm confident my colleagues, Estonian and Lithuanian ambassadors would agree. We are very, very Europeanist, and Spanish official policy is also very Europeanist. European values and European institutions are those which are really considered important, and also we feel responsibility for solidarity in European Union, and we feel interest to promote this European project. Spain joined the European Union at that time with another name earlier than Baltic states. We joined 2004. We did our homework, which was a heavy one, and Mr. Jurkynas mentioned about this transformation. What really can be said was a fast one, but very deep, and it was a really system transformation, and sometimes also said a mentality transformation. With this mentality issue, I probably wouldn't agree with those who say that Baltic nations were completely Sovietized. No. Baltic nations as European nations were and are bearing European values in their backbone, and this was not possible to destroy despite of the attempts, which were very, very hard and systematic during the Soviet occupation. So we were ready to continue to be in Europe, but on legitimate basis. It was not our own wish to step down from the European stage. We were pushed off the European stage, and we were welcomed back after we did the necessary changes. In Spain, there were a certain period which differed from the majority of European countries, and Western democracies didn't recognize the period of authoritarian rule in Spain as such which can be welcomed in the democratic West. And then also Spain went through the transition and this hard transition, and as I remember, Professor Powell, when you were giving marvelous lectures in Caixa Forum about the transition in Spain, saying that it was not perfect, but it was successful. So you were successful, Spain, so Baltic states were also successful, and Mr. Jurkynas mentioned it in his introductory speech. We feel Latvians in Spain welcomed. We know that Spain didn't recognize annexation and incorporation of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia into the Soviet Union, and it is important element in our attitude towards Spain, and also important for Spain's attitude to the Baltic states.
Thank you. That was please.
I could add up a little bit. That was a very good question, Charles. What does Europe mean? And it immediately brought out some memories in the early 90s when the Lithuanian politicians were talking to European officials, and they were asking, why do you want to join European Union? Look, you've been in the Union, in the Soviet Union, and now you want to move to European Union. And I guess it was the fact of President of Lithuania, Professor Vytautas Landsbergis, who slightly scratched his head and said, well, you see, there is no Siberia in European Union. That was a reference about deportations that the Soviets carried out against the Baltic populations in the 40s and later, moving thousands and thousands of people to Siberia. But the jokes apart, European dimension has always been seen as, one of the Lithuanian scholars wrote an article called Paradise Regained. I guess it was Inga Pavlovaitė, the Danish Research Institute. And the idea of paradise has included many dimensions. The first was come back home, reestablishment of civilizational justice, that the Soviet occupation has ripped off the Baltic states from the European continent and deprived them of all the chances of development they could have had in the wake of the Second World War. The second was that Europe was the winner. In a Fukuyamian sense, the end of history and the last man. Of course, we can criticize Fukuyama now retrospectively because he didn't foresee the rise of nationalism and religious fundamentalism and their manipulative and mobilizing power. But apart from that, the West, with the liberal democracy, with the integrationist projects, with capitalism, were the winners. And we were also wanted to be the winners. We want to emulate the winners. So we want to be part of that club. Thirdly, the idea of Europe also implied that we can be part of joint decision making. You know, in basketball terms, basketball is popular in Spain as well as in the Baltic states. You might not be among the first five and the second five players, but you can be a good substitute. Maybe do a good couple, good rebounds, maybe score a point or two. Maybe it won't do a lot, but still, it's a contribution. If you're not in a team, you just can shout, and wave your flags, but you won't change much the course of the game. It says better to be in and out. And last but not least, it was also a rational, pragmatic calculation that being in the European Union, you can get a lot of assistance in terms of financial terms to rebuild the societies which badly needed the investments. And I must say that the Lithuanian budget consists of 25% of the co-financing coming from the EU. And I remember the early commercials and the early notice saying that this is the support from the European Union, the road, come and touch it. So yeah, all those four elements can quite neatly summarize what was the idea of Europe for the Baltic states.
Thank you. Argita said that the Baltic states were never Sovietized, and you have used this very interesting concept of civilizational justice, which really goes far beyond transitional justice. Anders, what Soviet legacies are the Baltic states still trying to digest?
Well, perhaps the biggest legacy of the Soviet period, of course, was the demographic change. That particularly pertains to Estonia and Latvia. For instance, Estonia at the end of the Second World War was more than 90% ethnically Estonian, more homogeneous than it had been for centuries. This, of course, was due to genocide on the part of the Nazis against the Jews, deportations by the Soviets of Estonians, and the same. And by the end of the Soviet period, then at the end of the 80s, the Estonian component in the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic in the USSR was roughly about 62% of the population. And in the Latvian case, it was a similar trend, perhaps even more dramatic, where the Latvian population at the end of the Second World War was a bit more than 75% ethnic Latvian, and it was close to only 51-52% by the end of the Soviet period. So that's perhaps the most tricky question of how to integrate effectively people who've come during the Soviet period. So you could say that Estonia and Latvia in Europe have the highest portion of people born outside of their countries. And it also, I would say, does influence the way people think about the refugee and migration crisis going on in Europe today as well. That's one frame for it. And the integration question, well, would seem to be, now we're jumping ahead to present and future, the integration question, which, having joined the European Union and NATO, it seemed that it was slowly solving itself, that it was a question of generations over time, that it was the older generation that remembered the Russian speakers who remembered the Soviet period and had nostalgia, and that younger generations would be better integrated. But that sort of rosy approach has been, I think, upset somewhat by Russian actions in Ukraine, the fact that the Putin regime is trying to build up this sense of Russian self-pride and self-identity based on great power status, which naturally has some influence and impact on Russian speakers in our countries. So that divide in society has received a lot of attention again, even though it seemed that after independence, it was an issue in the 90s, and when we joined the European Union, that it was going to fade over time, and now it's being, I would say, you don't see it when you're there on the ground, you don't see it in people-to-people contacts, but it's more about the question of Estonians and Latvians on the one hand have different sources of information than the Russian speakers, who tend to get their information from Russian television, which tells a completely different narrative. So it's more a question of being in a different information space rather than any sort of segregation in daily life. But that, perhaps, in answering your question, is the major Soviet legacy, which takes the most effort and time to get over. But so far, it hasn't been perfect, but it's been successful, as was said earlier.
Thank you. Argita, would you share that view? That the integration of the Russian-speaking population is perhaps your biggest societal challenge today?
Referring to the policy what Latvia as a state had during the interwar period, the minority issues, this was, it is considered, and it was considered a successful one. And we, as a state, continue the minority policy in the same manner. As facts show, the changes in demographic situation really were huge in Latvia. So from 75 to 52% of ethnic Latvians. It's not easy to lose nearly 130,000 people of the population of Latvia, when of 2 million approximately. But as I mentioned, minority policy is taken very cautious and approach, and it's will be continued in this way. Whether people who speak language Russian or Ukrainian or Polish or Estonian at their homes, whether they feel Latvian by belonging to the state, it is their private choice, and it is reflected in their. If they haven't been citizens, they naturalize and become citizens. So the language issue is not an issue of such a tremendous importance to my mind, because the statistics also show that the conduct of Latvian language among people living in Latvia is close to 85, even more %. It differs from the pool which has been done. And sometimes this impression that there is a topic of difficulties for people who use Russian language in everyday communication, that for them it is a difficult life in Latvia. This image is artificially created, I would like to say. So, and referring to consciously designed information programs which try to put this issue as a trouble. Those people who live in Latvia, and the choice has been done by themselves, and consider the European Union as and the way of living what our membership in European Union provides. This way of living much closer to their needs than a way which is offered by other countries in neighborhood. And I think one of the proofs for that is that emigration towards Russia, for instance, is rather small of the Latvian of the population in Latvia, but we have to face facts, and we have to face numbers. So numbers matters, but nothing is constant. Everything changes, and now with 13 years in European Union and NATO, I think life has proved, and people of different ethnic belongings as well, that to live in this system is much convenient and pleasant than in another ones. It would be my comment.
Thank you. Earlier, actually, Mindaugas, you were mentioning the fourfold challenges that the Baltic states had to tackle in your transitions to democracy, and I was reminded of the German political scientist Klaus Offer, who used to say, the Spanish transition was fine, but it's not a useful model. Your success was overdetermined. As you were saying earlier, you already had a market economy, so for you the main challenge was simply the political transition. The economic transition was not such a big deal. But actually, Klaus Offer underestimated a challenge that Spain did face, and that is what some political scientists call stateness, the challenge of stateness. In other words, how to create a democracy, a plural multinational democracy. So what are your feelings about Lithuania's performance on that front?
It in a way relates to what Andres and Argita have said, mentioning also a plurality of their societies, which came out as the result of the forceful incorporation of the countries and forceful I don't know if I can use the word decolonization of the countries by sending a number of the Russian speakers from the Soviet Union to Latvia and Estonia to a great extent, changing the ethnic composition of the countries, comparing with the interwar times, as Andres mentioned. Lithuania, to that extent, also retained some degree of plurality, though to a lower extent, as by the end of the 80s, Lithuanians comprised 79% as a titular nation, so to speak, and the ethnic minorities, the new Arivistas from the Soviet Union, they comprised close to 20%. But in that respect, it didn't mean that the Lithuanians could get away for not taking into account plurality of the multi-ethnicity of the Lithuanian society. And for that reason, maybe it was easier to give citizenship to all the residents in Lithuania in the beginning of the 90s, and in a way, this more favorable ethnic composition allowed to solve this question without much of a political ramble. But on the other hand, there were quite a few of other Soviet legacies left, apart from those that my colleagues have already mentioned. And that brings me to the old and worn-off diplomatic joke about the Baltic states. What are the foreign security priorities of the Baltic states? So the first is Russia, the second is Russia, and we forgot the third one, but it must be Russia. So the legacy of the Soviet Union is the omnipresence of Russia, starting with propaganda and TV channels, and ending up sometimes with manipulating some of the more radical elements of the Russian-speaking community. And what comes into my picture as a memory is the events when Estonians decided to transfer the bronze soldier from the city center to the cemetery, as it is a very civilized way to do, and what happened afterwards, all the hysteria that Russia has caused and attacked Estonia in the virtual front, electronically, and so on. We all well remember that. So it means that the legacy of Russia's geopolitical presence, it's not a paranoia. And now the former Swedish Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Carl Bildt has numerously said, not only in his tweets, that I'm afraid the Balts were right. We thought they were just paranoid, and they were really, shouting a lot when Russia occupied Georgian parts of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But then the real eye-opener was Crimea, actually, and what's happening in Donbass. And for that reason, this geopolitical legacy frames very much the Baltic identity, Baltic togetherness, and Baltic cooperation in general, the Baltic awareness, because we've been there, we know it, we still feel it, and it's hard to recoil from that. And in that respect, when you look at foreign and security policy options in the Baltic states, it's very much of the same Soviet legacy, Russia, as I say, the geopolitical vicinity. When you read political statements of the Baltic high-ranking officials, presidents, foreign ministers, prime ministers, they focus on several topics. I myself had a short stint as Prime Minister's advisor on foreign national security policy in the late noughties. And one of the jobs for the Prime Minister's advisor is to write foreign policy speeches. That's an easy job because you've got just 3 topics. It's like in a good restaurant, the short menu, fresh ingredients. And it means that the Baltic states, they focus on 3 things. The first is energy security. Even though they've become legally, institutionally, politically independent and part of the transatlantic community, look at electricity links, gas pipelines, we're still part of the good old Soviet Union. Taken in inverted commas. The second topic is Eastern Partnership and Russia, meaning to use those transformational experiences, not perfect but still successful, maybe not a quantum leap but still a change, how to transform. And this idea has resonated quite well in a number of Eastern Partnership countries, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine for that matter. The small Baltic states, they don't seem patronizing. They've done quite well. They've been the members of the Soviet Union. Now look what they are. Of course, they're not perfect. Social disparities, emigration, they're tainted by a number of problems, but to a much lesser degree than the countries in the Eastern Partnership. And the idea of Eastern Europe is not sexy anymore. I mean, nobody in the Baltic states wants to be called Eastern Europeans. Well, Financial Times does that every now and again. Eastern European markets, from Czechs, to Estonians, like, what? No, come on. We are not Eastern European anymore. Eastern Europe, I mean, is tainted by poverty, marginalization, high corruption, influence on Russia, and so on. Anything that the Baltic states are. And for that matter, Eastern Partnership idea to bring more Europe and to push away the Russian, Kremlin-infused policy-making, political lifestyle is one of the niches that the Baltic states do because of the Soviet legacy, because of the Russian geopolitical presence. And the third topic for the speech is usually more NATO and more EU. Yes, we want Euro. It's economy. No, it's security. It's identity. We need spearhead forces in the Baltic states because of Russia again. So this legacy, 27 years have passed, has not evaporated yet.
Excellent, thank you. Let me just ask you all one final question. You've already raised it, actually, and it is the elephant in the room, or shall I say the bear in the room, which you have already raised. From your unique Baltic perspective, do you think the EU and NATO are standing up to the Russian threat in a manner that is acceptable to you, pleasing, reassuring? What are we doing wrong? What else should we be doing that we aren't doing? How fed up are you of us sitting comfortably in the far west of the European Union, being rather patronizing, telling you not to be too paranoid, everything's going to be all right?
Well, some of that answer was, I think, already in Mindaugas's words, but let me just pick up first where Mindaugas left off and speak about the Europeanization and how it relates to security. Everyone probably knows that the three most recent members of the single currency, the euro, are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And Estonia was first, and it joined in the midst of the financial crisis, and outside observers thought this was rather odd. Why would we be doing this when it seemed that the foundations of the Eurozone were crumbling and inflicting austerity upon ourselves? But it was the Estonian Prime Minister at the time, who's now our Commissioner in the European Commission, Andrus Ansip, who I think was probably the first EU Prime Minister to refer to the single currency not in financial or economic terms, but he said very clearly that it's a matter of our security in the broadest sense. That it's been, I think, from the very beginning of the 90s, the guiding principle or axiom of the foreign and security policies of all three countries that to join and to as deeply integrate in as many international organizations and Western clubs as possible and as quickly as possible, because in the 90s there was a clear sense that there was a window of opportunity that might close soon. Now we've seen it close in the East. I don't expect that there will be new members of the European Union anytime soon. That window closed on the part of Russia's actions, but also the fatigue towards enlargement that we face in the European Union itself. So it was a race against time. Fortunately, there was a strong societal consensus to distance ourselves as quickly as possible from the Soviet experience, which is very different from countries like Ukraine or Moldova, which in the 90s were undecided and dithered and were perhaps under more Russian influence, and now are in great difficulties. We made the tough choices in the 90s, and there was societal consensus, and it was mainly driven by the bear in the room, as you were saying, this longer understanding of history that we do have this window of opportunity that we must grab a hold of. And European Union enlargement in the 90s and early 2000s was also designed, I would say, to help us, because unlike perhaps in previous rounds of EU enlargement, there was a very clear focus on fulfilling objective criteria and doing your homework. And this suited us very well. That was because otherwise the geopolitical considerations were against us, because you don't want to cross the red line of what was the former Soviet Union, you don't want to provoke Russia, plus having been in the Soviet Union, we were poor, less developed than the Warsaw Pact countries. So in terms of political, economic arguments, we were the least promising candidates at the time. But since enlargement was based on objective criteria, we were, perhaps compared to some of the other Central Eastern Europeans, much more focused on doing our homework and doing it well and convincingly. And those goals fit us very well because it went with the transition that Mindaugas was talking about, that we had to transform our societies anyway. We weren't doing this just to please the European Union. We had to do it for ourselves, and it coincided in time, which again is a difference perhaps from Ukraine or Moldova, when the reforms are tougher to do and the motivation is very much different. But coming back to your original question about the situation today, post Crimea, that what I think is in the talking points of all of our diplomats is that the most important thing is that Europe speaks with one voice towards Russia. And I think that's been the biggest surprise to Putin and company in the Kremlin, is that he did not expect the Europeans to speak with one voice and maintain this position for more than maybe 6 months. And every 6 months it seems that, maybe the sanctions will be rolled over. But we saw the meeting with Merkel and Putin the other day in Sochi, and that message was reaffirmed. So it seems that the Russians have a new tack, that perhaps they can undermine European unity by perhaps interfering or influencing national elections, as we're seeing with Le Pen in France, and hopefully not in Germany in the fall. But of course they got a big victory with Brexit. Not to say that they were behind this, but it's certainly sad for us, and something that it was probably viewed well in Moscow. But on the sanctions, one also hears very often that they are detrimental for European trade. Of course, it's the counter-sanctions that Russia imposed on our agricultural products, which are very much hurting the Baltic countries. But it's odd to hear from some other countries, without picking on it. I'll pick on, say, Italy, perhaps, that they complain about maybe large energy companies not being able to do deals, but it doesn't really have any impact on the Italian citizenry. The sanctions, Russia's counter-sanctions, hurt our populations more than it hurts anyone else across the European Union, because of particularly its agricultural sector, transit, tourism, everything. However, we are staunchly behind the continuation of the sanctions because the higher principle of maintaining the existing international system and international law, the value of upholding our existing international law system is worth it, is worth that short-term pain. And when we look at it, what else can the European Union do? And what is in the European Union's toolbox? We can't say that, we'll forget about what happened in Ukraine. How can the European Union signal and be taken seriously, that signals that this is not really acceptable in the 21st century? The only toolbox is sanctions.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add anything to that?
Very, very shortly. Andres was very right and precise, saying that pacta sunt servanda, that you stick to the agreements and the principles. And one thing that I wanted to bring your attention on, correct me if I'm wrong, that when Russia invaded Crimea and occupied it by organizing illegal fake referendum and annexed it to Russia, Russia got sanctions. When Russia invaded in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, Russia got sanctions. So Russia got sanctions for breaking international law. And the small states just love international law and international arrangements and regional international organizations because they set rules of common behavior, small and big powers. And then, when Russia introduced countermeasures, counter-sanctions with banning agricultural products from the European Union countries, European Union did not reply to that. So Russia does one annexation, reply. Invasion, reply. Counter sanctions, no reply. So we should keep in mind that Russia made 3 steps and we replied just with 2. So in that respect, we should not think that if Russia suddenly says, okay, you drop the agricultural import ban, and we shouldn't just say, go around shouting hallelujah, I mean, now Russia made a step, we are opening. No, it just got back to normal. So if you think that the laws are worth something, the international laws are worth something, where everybody can thrive for peaceful cooperation and peaceful interaction, then I guess that's the principle that is worth abiding with.
And then we'll throw it open to the...
I just wanted to add one little element to that what was mentioned about Carl Bildt. And really the Swedish politician, the former prime minister, former foreign minister, and now a very active blogger and participant of conferences, he has played a tremendously important role for Baltic states in raising awareness in Western Europe and in West as such about Baltic states. Remember in the beginning of 90s his famous description of Russian democracy and the Baltic states as a litmus test of the Russian democracy. And in nowadays it's sometimes referred to this comparison, saying the same about behavior of Russia and the possibility to solve the Eastern Ukrainian issue and Crimea. It is really a litmus test for Russian will to change. Until now, we haven't seen this will, and if to speak about sanctions, so this is an answer that they are in place, and the unity of European Union as well. And I would like also to say, in certain extent, NATO response is because of this uncivilized behavior in Ukraine from Russian side. I have been ambassador in Ukraine until 2015, so have visited both Crimea and also Eastern Ukraine, seen with my own eyes what's there. So just it was my comment about Carl Bildt to mention this name. He played an important role for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's open the conversation up to the floor. Please feel free to ask your questions either in English or in Spanish. And please introduce yourselves so that...
Yeah, I'm Servando de la Torre, I'm retired diplomat. And I have a question, since it seems as security concerns prevail over other considerations of European identity or European integration, is it not true that perhaps the Americans and the NATO organization is more trustworthy than any other European defense effort to defend the interests of the Baltics? Otherwise, how much the Baltic governments would be ready to join a intensive, how is it called in European Union?
PESCO. Are you referring to Permanent Structured Cooperation?
A special action for defense in the European Union framework.
Are there any more questions from... Yes, the young lady in the middle.
It's for you. You said you have been to Moscow to speak about your book, and I wanted to ask you if you felt confident and free to speak about it in the same way you are doing it here.
He came back, which is nice. I was in Moscow this weekend, by the way. Lovely city, 25 degrees. Any other questions? Well, let's start with, who would like to answer the question about NATO versus EU in terms of security provision?
Okay, very shortly, as there's much to catch on. I guess the message is pretty clear. I mean, at least what I've heard and what I found out in the Baltic states, their foreign and security policy principle is that NATO comes first when it comes to defense, and no other institution should duplicate it as long as NATO is the key provider of security guarantees. So full stop here, and any other defense, or deterrence initiatives are only welcome as long as they complement the NATO capabilities. So therefore, the Baltic states so far rely mainly on a NATO framework, and they think that's the key principle for the security as small countries.
Exactly, a complementary principle. Cooperation, coordination, and the European army as such, not an issue, but a smooth cooperation between European Union member states and NATO as organization, yes.
I will continue with that before I answer the Moscow question. It is clear that the Baltic countries were very transatlantic. It was very evident during the Iraq War 2003. But I would say that the Baltic states have become amongst the most pro-European integrationist countries in the entire Union. I had the example of what the motivation might be driven by security, indeed. Like I had the example of the single currency. But the result is, for instance, that the Baltic countries are, in Northern Europe, the most integrated countries. No one else in Northern Europe belongs to the European Union, is in the Eurozone, and is in NATO. There's all sorts of other combinations in Northern Europe, but no one has the full integrated package, which really shows that motivation. And I perceive, at least in the last few years, that the Baltic states have become much more open to European defense cooperation than they were earlier fearing this duplication with NATO. But I think in the policy and practical steps that you have seen in the last few years, yes, NATO obviously in terms of real defense challenges is the first stop. But I don't think Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians will, if European defense cooperation goes ahead, the Baltic states will want to be, also as Mindaugas had his basketball analogy earlier, will want to be part of the team or be behind the table. They won't want to be left behind in any of these initiatives. And as the Moscow question, when I was there, I spoke at GIMO, which is the University for International Relations, where the Russians train their diplomats, and at the Higher School of Economics, so mainly to students and faculty, and in English rather than Russian. There I was received very well. We talked mostly about current affairs. The only, we didn't talk about occupation and annexation. Didn't come up, no one asked, and I didn't mention it. But the sort of questions from the students, the only sort of difficult ones were, why do you Balts like the Americans more than you like us? And well, my reply was that I don't think that they need to be necessarily mutually exclusive, that we would like to be friends with you as well. And when we were talking about sanctions earlier, then of course the Baltic states would be the first beneficiaries if the European Union and Russia would have good relations, because we are neighbors and we do have an active interaction in terms of trade and people. So, but the international principles and values are tantamount or paramount in this question.
Charles, if I may just to chime in very shortly, that question I remember was raised in a debate. A very good friend of mine had a discussion with his neighbor in a provincial town in Lithuania, and that neighbor of my friend, he watches quite a lot of the Russian TV, and he raised the same question. So why do you love Americans so much and don't like Russians? And my friend said, look, what did the Americans do to you? Did the Americans do anything for Lithuania? No. Bad? Good? No. But when it comes to history and when it comes to Soviet Union, then you can clearly pinpoint what's wrong has been done. But the Americans, they haven't done anything bad. That was a simple answer.
I suppose the next time I'm asked that question, I will say, read Anders' book. Okay, on that note, thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers today for their presence here.